Mwah. To the people upstairs, thank you. Randall, before we dive right in, can I just thank everybody for coming out? This is not an inexpensive evening, and I know there's a lot of competition in Houston for your entertainment dollar. For example, Ted Cruz is speaking tonight. He is, well, no, he is over at the Regressive Forum, and that should be good. But thanks for choosing me. Thanks for choosing me over Ted. Now, I leave it to you to choose someone else over Ted next time around, okay? I think, if you know what I mean. It all starts here at the Progressive Forum, right?
Absolutely, and I want to note that in 18 years, no other speaker has been in touch as much as you, promoted the event. You're the only one. You've just been a joy to work with, and we really love having you.
Clinically, that's called neurosis, and they have not yet found a cure, but thank you for thanking me. I appreciate it.
We've got group therapy going on.
We do. I can feel it. I can feel a lot of unbalanced people here tonight. I can feel it.
We are. It's been a hard few years.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. So let's begin on your book. It outlines 3 stages of ignorance, to me, which sounds like stages of grief. You know, this is group therapy here. The first is ridicule. The second is acceptance. And the third is celebration of ignorance.
Yes.
How did we get started on this path of ignorance that I'm laughing already, so.
Well, I'm glad you're enjoying what you're saying, Randall. It's great because you can talk to yourself all day like this and keep yourself in a state of delight.
Yeah, just keep you grinning.
I mean, you don't need those psychedelics that Michael Pollan's got. You can just do it yourself.
On it, yeah.
Well, I want to get into that. First, I want to get a sense of the lay of the land here a little bit. Are there any Borowitz Report readers here tonight? Okay. Well, for those of you who aren't familiar with the Borowitz Report, every day I make shit up. That's sort of what I do. It's kind of like, are you familiar with Sean Hannity? Yes, it's in that genre. He's actually my main competition. But there was actually big news today. I don't know did you read the big news about Rupert Murdoch? Yes. He has begun his transition from Fox News to hell, which I think is exciting. But that's an example of my reporting at the Borowitz Report. It's made up news, and the book is a real departure from that because the book is 100% true. It's all factual. It's a history book, and everything in it actually happened, unfortunately, I should add, because I really did research on ignorance among our politicians and how it has increased over the past 50 years. And when I got into this, I realized that ignorance is nothing new in our politicians. We've always had dumb politicians. Will Rogers, the great American humorist, had a great line, which I'm always quoting, which is he said, "There's no trick to being a political humorist when you have the whole government working for you." And I mean, that's basically true, always true. But something happened in the last 50 years, 50, 60 years, which is that we had this rise in mass media really governing our politics. And what that meant was that politicians had to start becoming kind of zoo animals and performers rather than knowledgeable people who knew actually how to do their jobs and how to make our lives better. And the 3 phases that you described, ridicule, acceptance, and celebration, break down very simply like this, and then I want to talk about some of the main heroes of these phases. In the ridicule phase, which is, I mean, some people in the audience might remember this, kind of a halcyon era of the 50s and before, where we expected our politicians to know shit. So dumb politicians had to pretend to be smart. Now, in the acceptance phase, which happened more or less in the 80s and 90s and beyond, being ignorant started becoming a sign of authenticity. It meant you were a regular guy, somebody you'd want to have a beer with. And so dumb politicians felt free to appear dumb. And now we're in the celebration phase where we celebrate ignoramuses over experts and people who don't know things over people who've read books. And so now we're in this weird phase where everything has been turned upside down and smart politicians have to pretend to be dumb. So that's where we are. Good night, everybody. That's our show. I'm going to leave you on that suicidal note. So you might ask, like, how this started. Where did we go from ridicule to acceptance to celebration? A key inflection point that I like to talk about is the 1960 debate between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon, because believe it or not, that was the first televised debate. And both Nixon and Kennedy were really well-informed guys. And if you listen to that debate on the radio, anecdotally, a lot of people thought that Nixon won. But people who watched it on TV thought Kennedy won because Kennedy was better looking, he wasn't sweaty like Nixon, he appeared to have shaved in the last week. And this is not a small point, he had fucking fantastic hair. And in politics, hair is so important. It's like, if you look at like John F. Kennedy, look at your own Rick Perry, right? Rick Perry had only 3 things going for him: great hair, great suits, and I can't remember the third. Oops. I can't. Oops. Sorry, I had to do that. Because I'm in Texas. I had to do that joke. But this debate, what happened was Kennedy won the debate, he won the election, and this taught like the political pros a very dangerous lesson. And it's like a genie that we can never put back in the bottle, which is to be president, you have to be good on TV. So cut to 6 years later, 1966, California, a bunch of Republican industrialists want to take back the governor's mansion. And they try to reverse engineer this whole problem of being good on TV as a politician. They say, instead of finding a politician who's really knowledgeable and teaching him how to be good on TV, we're just going to find somebody who's really awesome at being on TV, and we're going to sort of funnel enough sound bites into him so that he sounds intelligent enough to be governor. Uh-oh. There you go again. That's right. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was the sort of the test tube baby of this whole horrible process. And what they did is, Ronald Reagan was a big TV star. He had been on the GE, General Electric Hour, and then he'd been on Death Valley Days. He was basically unemployed at this point, but he was good looking. He could look down the barrel of a TV camera and be very, very sincere. There was only one problem with Ronald Reagan, which was that he knew absolutely nothing. I mean nothing. Ronald Reagan now is sort of deified as like the great communicator and this guy who like ended the Cold War and everything. And he said, tear down that wall, showing a tremendous mastery of monosyllabic words. But Ronald Reagan knew absolutely nothing. Here's an example of the ignorance of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, when he was president of the United States, did not know that South America was composed of different countries. That is true. He said, it's amazing. He came back from a trip to South America, was blown away by the fact that they had all these different countries down there. He also thought that trees polluted more than cars did. And he honestly said this, and when he was campaigning in 1980, he went to Claremont College in California, and the students at Claremont College tacked a sign to a tree that said, "Chop me down before I kill again." So Ronald Reagan was trained he was taught all these sound bites, and he won the election in California by over 1 million votes. And we have never really looked back from that point because it taught a very dangerous lesson, which is you have somebody who's good on TV and seems knowledgeable enough, and that's enough to elect somebody. And it worked then, and it was tried again less successfully in 1988. They had this guy, Stu Spencer, who was kind of the Svengali who masterminded Ronald Reagan's campaign. He was brought on board in 1988 by the Republicans, not to manage George H.W. Bush, but to manage his vice presidential candidate, a guy who you may remember named Dan Quayle. I don't know if that name rings a bell. Am I bringing back terrible nightmares now just by uttering that name? But that's Stu Spencer tried to do that Reagan magic all over again with Dan Quayle, and it utterly failed. Now, in the book, and though some of you have maybe thumbed through it, I'm a little bit hard on Dan Quayle. And I've got to tell you something, what's more important to me than anything as a man is to be fair. I think when you hear the name Andy Borowitz, the first thing that occurs to you is fairness, right? Always very bipartisan, always looking to the other side, trying to be generous. And so I actually reached out to Dan Quayle to see if he would join us at the Progressive Forum tonight. I emailed him, and he wrote back and he said he was otherwise enraged. But because I'm so fair, I was thinking, who tonight at the Progressive Forum, who will speak for Dan Quayle? And I think it falls upon me to do so. And so I've actually brought with me some of the wisdom of Dan Quayle. This is actually the complete knowledge of Dan Quayle, unabridged. And I'm going to, this is word for word things that Dan Quayle actually said, and we're going to try to rebuild his legacy here tonight in Houston. Okay. This is Dan Quayle on education. Quite frankly, teachers are the only profession that teach our children. Ferris Bueller's Day Off is my favorite movie because it reminds me of my time in school. You take the United Negro College Fund model that what a waste it is to lose one's mind, or not to have a mind is being very wasteful. How true that is. Dan Quayle on geography. We have a firm commitment to Europe. We are a part of Europe. I love California. I practically grew up in Phoenix. It's wonderful to be here in the great state of Chicago. Dan Quayle on outer space. Space is almost infinite. As a matter of fact, we think it is infinite. For NASA, space is still a high priority. It's time for the human race to enter the solar system. Shall I go on? Why stop now? Dan Quayle on the vice presidency. One word sums up probably the responsibility of any vice president, and that one word is to be prepared. Dan Quayle, Master Detective. When I've been asked during these last weeks who caused the riots and the killing in LA, my answer has been direct and simple. Who is to blame for the riots? The rioters are to blame. Who is to blame for the killings? The killers are to blame. You're getting good at this. You will suffer permanent brain damage as a result. All right, Dan Quayle, time traveler. I have made good judgments in the past. I have made good judgments in the future. That is my favorite, actually. The future will be better tomorrow. The real question for 1988 is whether we're going to go forward to tomorrow or past to the back. And finally, because you've been so patient, Dan Quayle on family values. Illegitimacy is something we should talk about in terms of not having it. And finally, Republicans understand the importance of bondage between parent and child. There you go. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Was I being fair enough?
Let's just keep accelerating. Can you hear me?
Microphone. Mic this bit.
Is it still working?
No, we need maybe pick up the emergency mic.
Okay.
We have the technology here. Got one? There you go. Let's see if that one works.
How do you turn it on? What? Getting a lot of help here.
See, this is why we keep losing elections. Our mics don't fucking work. Everybody can hear what like Louis fucking Gohmert is saying, but he's got smart things
Hello?
saying no. Oh, finally.
It's on. I just tried to use it.
Yeah. But I mean, we make a good point. You libs have got to get your microphones to work. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
This is group therapy. It's all acceptable.
Okay,
You know.
fine. Radical acceptance.
I want to ask you for your Reagan story about Jim Baker, who's here in Houston, from Houston, took Reagan to task for shrugging things off. Could you share that story?
This is a true story, too. I mean, everything in the book is true, honestly, so I won't keep on reiterating that. But when Reagan was president, Jim Baker, for a while, he went through a number of chiefs of staff, but Jim Baker was his chief of staff. And it was the eve of a very important economic summit. And Jim Baker left him this binder, a briefing book that he had, painstakingly prepared for Reagan. And he went in the next morning, the morning of the summit, and he noticed that Reagan had not even cracked the book. It was clearly just sitting in exactly the same place where he had left it. And Jim Baker said to him, "Mr. President, how come you didn't look at the briefing book?" And Reagan said, "Well, Jim, The Sound of Music was on TV last night." That is true. That is 100% true. There you go again.
There you go again. What about the stage of acceptance of ignorance? What do you mean by that?
Well, this is really a stage that I think Texas can take tremendous pride in because, first of all, can I just say something? People give Texas a lot of shit, but I could not have written this book without Texas. Okay? Honestly.
Molly Ivins is in your book.
Yeah, Molly Ivins is throughout the book. I mean, yes, let's hear it for Molly Ivins. There's no one better. As I was doing research, I realized, so that's why Molly Ivins liked to stay in Texas and write about Texas. It makes perfect sense because there's so much great material. I mean, Wisconsin doesn't show up once in the book, but only because I didn't write about Scott Walker. But, okay, so we get to the ridicule phase, as just to recap, dumb politicians still had to pretend to be smart. And so it worked for Reagan because he was a good actor and he could pull it off. It didn't work for Dan Quayle because he was just a startled deer and literally just froze up, and whenever he had to say anything on camera, he just seemed like the idiot that he was. Interestingly enough, he passed the torch to a guy in the acceptance phase who he had an awful lot of common with. He went to the same fraternity. He was the same generation of generational wealth. He was the same kind of, white, wealthy, privileged guy who didn't do very much and didn't crack a book in college. And that guy was your governor, George W. Bush. So George W. Bush was really the founding father of the acceptance stage of ignorance, because he much like Reagan and Quayle, he didn't know very much, but he approached that problem very differently, because those two guys still had to pretend that they knew things. Reagan was good at pretending. Quayle was totally hopeless at pretending. George Bush dropped the pretense, and there was a specific moment in the 2000 election, he was running for president for the first time, when he kind of cracked the code, which was he was in Boston doing a TV interview, and there was a guy named Andy Hiller who was interviewing him at a local TV station, and Andy Hiller had this kind of shtick, which was he would have politicians on, and then he'd ambush them with a pop quiz. And so he thought it'd be good to ask George Bush, since George Bush was saying that he wanted to be the leader of the free world, he decided to ask him some foreign policy questions. But they weren't tricky questions. They were name the leaders of these 4 countries. And he ran 4 countries by them. Some of them were kind of famous, some of them were a little more obscure. But George Bush only got 1 out of 4 right. And in an earlier era, like in the ridicule era, doing so badly on a pop quiz like that would pretty much end your whole campaign. But Bush handled it very differently. His campaign handlers, led by Karl Rove, came up with a strategy which they had his communications director, a woman named Karen Hughes, come out and say, George W. Bush is running for president of the United States, not Jeopardy contestant. Now, this is a really interesting defense because it suggests that president of the United States is an easier gig than going on Jeopardy. But like most of these sound bites, like, there you go again, it didn't mean anything, but it worked in the moment. And what it did is it enabled George W. Bush to flip the script, because in the future, instead of doing what Quayle would have done, which is flounder because he didn't know the answer to a question, he would say, yeah, I don't know, who cares? And he would basically say, like, to the audience that, he doesn't know stuff, they don't know stuff, and that's okay. And he said that he would surround himself with really smart people, and they would do all the thinking, while he would do, I don't know, all the grinning? I don't know what he was going to be doing. But what it did was it reinforced this idea that the President of the United States shouldn't be well-informed or smart. He should be somebody, quote unquote, who you wanted to have a beer with. Now, there was this famous poll in 2000, it was the first time this was done, where they asked, who would you rather have a beer with, George W. Bush or Al Gore? And that was one contest where George W. Bush did not actually need the Supreme Court to win. He won it fair and square. More people wanted to have a beer with George W. Bush. Now, there are a couple of things to know about this quiz. First of all, I question why it's better to have a beer with a recovering alcoholic. I don't think that shows a good choice of drinking partner, unless maybe you think you can also have his beer because he won't have it. I don't know. But that was one aspect of it that was a little weird. But here's the weirdest aspect about that beer quiz. It's still revived every 4 years. They ask that question, who would you rather have a beer with? Well, the original poll was not conducted by like Gallup or Harris or some really established, legitimate polling operation. It was conducted by the Samuel Adams Beer Company. So our political system for the last 20 years has been kind of ruled by this question that was come up with as a way of selling beer, and I should add, selling a really shitty beer. And that's what we've been doing. So now, I guarantee you in 2024, that question will come up again, who would you rather have a beer with? This is what the acceptance phase was all about. It was embracing ignorance in our politicians, saying it was a good thing, as opposed to Al Gore, who was considered brainy and nerdy and the guy who invented the internet and all that stuff. It was a very clear anti-intellectual choice that the country made, although it didn't really make it because, again, it needed the Supreme Court to get the victory. But it was an interesting pivot point, an inflection point in terms of our attitude towards ignorance, because it was no longer something to be hidden. It was something to be kind of embraced, it's all right.
Well, is there something about the personality of the president that maybe it's not the dumb thing, but because, a father figure, mother figure, uncle figure, just needs to be something natural about him that we can relate to, that, lower offices, it doesn't matter so much?
I think that's a really good question. I do think that, there's ample evidence that a guy who just gets up there and acts like a know-it-all is not going to be embraced. You do have to have the common touch. My whole point in this book, though, is why must that be a binary choice? Can't you have somebody who can connect with the American people but also actually reads the presidential daily brief, which is literally 3 pages long? That's all I ask. And I think I'm pretty hard on Democrats in the book too, and I'm hard on them for one reason, which is I feel like Democrats historically have fallen into this trap of just thinking, well, we're smarter than the other side, we know more stuff, so of course we'll get the votes. And that actually isn't how it works at all. You do have to connect with voters on a very visceral, personal level, but the key is to find people who combine both, who are smart, serious, curious, have intellectual humility, which leads to intellectual curiosity. And then they don't spend all their time bragging about how much they know, but while they use their personal skill to connect with the voters, they are, behind closed doors, they're also getting the job done. It doesn't have to be a binary choice, and I can think of examples of people who were good at both. FDR is a great example of this because he was a great speaker, he inspired people, he connected with people, but he knew what he didn't know. And a great example of this to me is the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl. We had this ecological disaster that we had never faced before. It was completely man-made, much like climate change, so it's a good paradigm. And he surrounded himself with experts. He figured out, with their help, how to solve this problem, and they did solve the problem. So he had both. He had intellectual curiosity and the ability to marshal facts, and more importantly, surround himself with experts, but he never lost sight of the fact that he had to connect with people. So I just don't think it's an either or. I think Barack Obama also had those two things going for him. I think, to me, the best president of my lifetime. People like to carp about Obama didn't do this and Obama didn't do that, but he was a pretty amazing president, especially when you consider he wasn't even born here. He had to learn our customs and our ways and, our language and everything, and you really have to say hats off to him for that.
Okay, how did we get to the celebration stage? We've done the acceptance. What did that lead to?
Well, just as Dan Quayle helped lead us to acceptance because his sort of fraternity blood brother was George W. Bush, the person who was key to sort of launching the celebration phase was somebody who, we don't think about too much these days, and for good reason, but it was Sarah Palin. Yes. Wait, someone applauded, yeah, she was good. Liked her. Whatever happened to her? Sarah, Sarah Palin was a key member of the acceptance phase because, of course, she was always saying, "I'm just a hockey mom," and and she would never say she did go to college. In fact, 6 of them. She literally did. I track her whole. She was like the Carmen Sandiego of American education. She just kept on bailing, and like the registrars are saying, "Where'd you go?" But she had her debate, her vice presidential debate in 2008 with then vice presidential candidate Joe Biden. And she said at the very beginning, she said, "I may not answer all the questions that get posed to me, but I'm going to straight talk to the American people." And it's like, that was like a really new kind of step forward in the March of Ignorance, because it was actually the whole point of these debates is to find out what people know. I mean, that is really the whole idea of it. It's like, you go to the DMV and you say like, "I may not say what color my eyes are, but I'm still going to get that driver's license." She was just basically, ahead of her time, in that she was denying the importance of facts. She was saying, "I'm just going to talk straight to the American people." Now, you may wonder why I'm just dwelling on her just to beat up on Sarah Palin. It's not. It's like she's an important historical figure because she was the gateway idiot who led to Donald Trump. She had his same sort of toxic brew of ignorance and grievance, because the way she went after Obama was not like, I disagree with Obama. It was like, Obama's a terrorist. He's palling around with terrorists. It was all this kind of not so subtle racist dog whistles, which then, Donald Trump kind of really ran with, when he, brought up his whole thing about, Mexicans being rapists and murderers. And also, I'm sure some very fine people, he threw that in like at the end. But, that whole thing to me is sort of like taking Sarah Palin to the next step. It was okay, we're going to do Sarah Palin without the subtlety. Without the nuance of Sarah Palin. We're now just going to like mainline Sarah Palin right into you. And so Donald Trump, to me, is the key player in the celebration phase. Although I would say he's not quite in the paradigm as I describe it, because remember, when I was describing celebration, I said in the celebration phase, because ignorance is now being celebrated, smart politicians have to pretend to be dumb. And in Donald Trump's case, no pretense was necessary. He actually is a very well-educated man. He went to University of Pennsylvania. His parents could afford to send him to the finest college, as much as George W. Bush went to Yale and never cracked a book. He had access to information, but he's a very arrogant guy, not a good student, and not a reader. He's never read an entire book in his adult life. We only know of one book that he actually owns, besides The Art of the Deal, which, by the way, he didn't write. It was written by a guy named Tony Schwartz, who was his ghostwriter. We don't even know if Donald Trump has read The Art of the Deal. I doubt it. But the only thing we know is that his late ex-wife, Ivana, said that he had one book at his bedside, which was a collection of speeches by Adolf Hitler. I believe he's probably read some of that, because you'd see sort of an homage in some of his speeches. But Donald Trump falls into this category of a guy who celebrates his ignorance and will do things like, he'll stare at an eclipse without sunglasses on. He'll tell us how to cure COVID by ingesting bleach. He'll say that the British had, fighter jets in the 18th century during the Revolutionary War. All these things are true, and they're cited in the book. He called 9/11 7/11. That's true too. But he comes by his ignorance very, very honestly. It's all very sincere. Whereas there's this whole other category of people in the celebration phase who are really smart, really well educated, but are doing their best to hide it and act like idiots. And this group includes the aforementioned Ted Cruz of Princeton University fame, Ron DeSantis, who went to both Harvard and Yale, Josh Hawley, who went to Ivy League college and is in fact the fastest man on earth. He clocked in it faster than Usain Bolt on January 6th. But I mean, all these guys are well-educated, very smart guys who, and I find this more offensive, their ignorance is totally performative. They're putting on a show of being stupid. And that to me is in a way, I find that in a way morally more offensive than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump really is doing the best he can. He really is, and so, by the way, are people people are hard on Marjorie Taylor Greene, but again, I think she is very sincere in her stupidity. I don't think that she is making anything else. And by the way, as long as I'm defending her, I think she's been really unfairly maligned for that whole comment she made about Jewish space lasers, because I'm gonna just be honest with you guys. I am Jewish, and I am so flattered that she thinks I could operate a space laser. I mean, I was so proud of myself when I figured out how to mute myself on Zoom. I mean, and Zoom is tricky. I mean, as you know, if you try to, look, if Jeff Toobin knew how to use Zoom, he'd still be on CNN. So, it's a tough thing. But space lasers, come on. Are there any Jews here tonight? I bet there are a few. Our history would have been so different if we had space lasers, like when we were running away from the gazpacho. So yeah. I love Marge. I love Lauren Boebert too. She's great. Did you see her yesterday when Merrick Garland was speaking and they cut to her and she was vaping in the audience? It was so amazing. She was doing that. By the way, she and Rudy Giuliani have completely ruined groping for me. That used to be my favorite fucking activity, and now I'm over it. I guess I'm digressing a little bit, but these are also important issues.
This is therapy, so
Yeah.
Let's get it all out. So you're all about the leaders in your book. What about the voters who are okay with these know-nothings? What's your perspective?
Well, it's an interesting question, because when I went, this is a research project. This is like writing a term paper. I did a lot of research, and I went in with certain biases, certain kind of suppositions, that some of which turned out to be true, and some of which didn't turn out to be true. And I sort of thought, well, where this is all going to lead me is that if we had better education in the country, then we would have better voters. We'd make better decisions. And I wasn't alone in this, because the guy who also believed this was FDR. He said, education is the key to democracy, because you can't have an uneducated populace making such important decisions. I have a slightly different feeling now, having done the research. And look, I'm not a historian. I'm not a sociologist or a neurologist like George Santos. I'm just a guy with opinions. But the fact is, smart people make bad voting decisions. And a lot of smart people voted for Donald Trump and would vote for him again. And in Germany, I hate to keep on bringing up this guy, but a lot of educated people voted for Hitler. They thought that Hitler was their best bet to keep communism out of Germany and to defeat communism. So the problem is we have all kinds of confirmation biases. We come into an election with all kinds of biases, and just being smart isn't enough. We do need to be, again, persuaded by somebody who is a great, I hate to say great communicator because that sounds like Reagan, but who's got that personal touch and that ability to cut through. And where I sort of come to at the end of the book is not, despite everything I've told you tonight, it's really not a depressing read. I am an optimist. Maybe I'm too optimistic, maybe I'm too idealistic, but I'm from the Midwest. It's kind of a cliche to say that Midwesterners have this kind of optimistic, can-do attitude, but that's just sort of my legacy. I'm stuck with that. And so I believe that we can do better and that we can improve as a country. But I think there's some important steps towards doing that. And by the way, I'm not trying to diminish the importance of education. Education is super important for so many things. I just don't think it's the silver bullet that's going to solve our problems with our democracy. So let me try this out on you and see what you think. And it's in the book, so you can take a look at it and see what you think. I have this trickle-down theory. We heard a lot about trickle-down economics, and Reagan started that. Trickle-down economics has never worked, okay? It keeps on coming. Every time somebody wants to cut taxes, they say, trickle-down, that'll work. I do believe, however, that trickle-down ignorance works. That if our politicians say stupid things, even if they're smart like Ron DeSantis, or if they're stupid like Donald Trump or Marjorie Taylor Greene, we look to politicians, as much as I make fun of them, most people look to politicians as authority figures. They're the people who supposedly know stuff. So ignorance trickles down, and politicians make all of us dumber as voters. So what's the solution to that? Well, I think if ignorance trickles down, knowledge can rise up from us. And how do you do that? You turn off cable news, you get off social media, except for my account, and you get active politically on a very granular local level. You canvass, you register voters, you get elected to your school board. You get elected to the board of your local library. Now, to give you an idea, I am putting my money where my mouth is because I wrote this in the book, and then somebody in my town, I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, somebody in my town said, well, why don't you volunteer to be on the board of the library then? And I had to really think about this because one thing I really am bad at is working with other people. It's really a hole in my game because in meetings I have this tendency if somebody says something stupid to sort of roll my eyes or sigh heavily like Al Gore at the George W. Bush debate. I just have a real hard time containing my contempt for my fellow humans. So that's something I'm going to have to learn. I've got the growth mindset now. I'm going to try to learn how not to do that. I'm going to try to learn how to be a team player. But my feeling is if I'm making that sacrifice, everybody here at the Progressive Forum can also do so. So we're all freaking out about 2024 and stuff like that. So watching MSNBC is not going to win one vote, folks. It's not going to change anything. All it's going to do is it's going to take time away from time where you could be out canvassing or registering people to vote or doing anything for a local candidate or running for local office yourself. I don't want to single out MSNBC because I think all the cable news networks are kind of equally hilarious. But MSNBC is we libs tend to gravitate towards it because it reinforces things that we think we already know. So it's really it's kind of like Fox for vegans. It's it's just it makes us feel good because, oh great, there are all these people who agree with us. But it doesn't really advance the ball just to sit there on your couch and watch that. Also, I should add, MSNBC has the worst slogan of any television network, or really any product ever. They had the slogan, "Lean forward." That is also the official slogan of the rectal exam. I mean, I want to know what the meeting was like when the Brain Trust and MSNBC decided that Lean Forward was their best possible slogan. I mean, what was their second choice? You might feel some pressure? I mean, I don't know. But anyway, I don't want to beat up on them because they're, I love Rachel Maddow and she's a great, talent and a great writer and all that. But it's just, if we're spending all of our time watching cable news and, getting into fights on social media with like Trump people, then the other side automatically wins. Automatically wins. Because they've taken your energy away from what really would be productive, which is seizing political power. That's what this is about. It's not about winning an argument on Facebook or Instagram or whatever. It's about politics is for power. It's for gaining power and making change. And the right wing has known that for a long time. If you read Jane Mayer's book, Dark Money, she talks about how they've spent decades trying to control the judiciary and think tanks, controlling the universities, and they've been very patient and very systematic. And now we've got to do that too, and we've got to wake up. So those are my marching orders, I guess.
Thank you.